couple of statements ago, right? IT management is a full-time activity. It's not something that you pick up, once a year for a month and you do your thing and you drop it again for a month. It requires constant monitoring as you pass through a yearly cycle, in our case, right, of having staff record their time on activities that they're working on, monitoring purchases, and taking on new staff and offboarding old staff. Our challenge in doing a monthly bill, and I'll be interested when we take questions at the end to hear feedback from you folks, is, we have a lot of contracts with vendors who bill us one time a year. IBM, for example, and the bill is several $1 million, right? So our fiscal year was April to March. So to say, in May, we're going to give you the cost for May, right? And the bill for IBM comes in October, right? So you're percolating along and you have May and June, it's not too much money, and boom, all of a sudden October comes and the world explodes because you have a several $1 million bill that now you've blown into these invoices, right? So we evaluated that possibility and said, is there a way to spread that out or project that amount? At the end of the day, we didn't feel that was worthwhile. We felt we were getting the traction that we needed on an annual cycle. The other thing I think for success is we gave some information and set expectations, right? We said we're going to produce the invoices once a year, and we're going to give you a draft invoice in June. Prior to me taking this over, part of the challenge or the frustration was we could never seem to get the bills produced in a timely manner. And we would get them produced and we'd hand them out and you'd find an error and you'd have to redo them, right? So one of the things that we said as we were trying to solidify this is we have to set some expectations and then we have to hit those expectations so that we're establishing some integrity with the customer and confidence with the customer. Because if you don't have those two things established, right, and you present them with a form and some numbers on it, they're going to be sitting there thinking, well, how do I know these numbers are correct, right? So provide the information, set some expectations, and deliver what you promised, but then make sure that you can deliver on what you promised, right? So don't shoot too high that you end up shooting yourself in the foot. Produce an invoice or a statement that's business friendly. Again, something that's meaningful and value to them, right? And the other thing that we ended up doing then was developing a glossary. In other words, on the invoice, we billed by services. So we created a glossary and said, service of application development. Well, that's defined as XYZ. And here are the metrics that we used to determine what the costs would be related around that, right? So, and we posted that out in a central repository. So when we sent out an invoice, if somebody had a question, instead of us being pummeled about what do you mean by this, or what is that, or what is the metric, there was a reference document that kind of took the weight of that off of our staff to have to respond, whether it was by email or phone calls or whatever, right? So, I've just thrown a lot of foundational information and some challenges that we had. What I'm happy to report is we've fortunately been extremely successful over the past few years, where we have delivered our invoices on time. And we believe that the data has integrity because the data is coming out of our two main systems that our agency supported, right? So we actually now have some actionable levers which are of value to the business, where we could have some discussions and ultimately give them a lever where they can affect what their bill of IT or their invoice will be. So I'll just talk about these a little bit and tell you how we achieve that, right? So every year we would be challenged by folks about how many managed workstations they had. You'd say I had X desktops or X laptops, right? I don't have that. Or That's not the right number. So strategically, we said, how can we address the problem? And this is where we began to leverage our ServiceNow platform, right? So in ServiceNow, in our asset management area, we know what device every employee had. Now, ServiceNow, again, came a little late to the party. We didn't have that at the onset, but we realized that we had that data that was really solid data, solid foundation. So when we provided the invoice, on the invoice, we'd show you have 26 desktops and 39 laptops. We augmented the invoice that we gave them with an Excel spreadsheet that listed every employee that belonged to their organization and what device they had, right? So we kind of were trying to beat them to the punch, right? Because before they would challenge it, we had really no legs to stand on, because we'd have to go back and research it and produce reports. We said, well, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to provide you with that inventory listing. And what we found was extremely enlightening, not only from our perspective, but from the business's perspective, because suddenly leaders in the business would say, well, wait a minute. It looks like Mary has 2 desktops and a laptop. Well, why does she have 3 devices? Because I don't support that, right? And managers would go back to the units and find out, sure enough, Mary does have those 3 devices, right? It happened over time as she was working on this project, or she needed a laptop because she was going to work at home or do something else, right? So all of a sudden the business could find value, an actionable lever. And then they began to look at the full list and the scope of employees that they were at. And many business leaders said, nope, my policy is 1 device per employee. Figure out which one you want, get back in touch with IT, but I'm not going to pay for 3 managed workstations. And that had peripheral fingers as well, right? Were there licenses for software on each of those 3 devices that we were paying 3 times for, that person obviously couldn't use all at once? Depending on your licensing model, of course, that could or may not be true. But one of the tangible main areas that the business could relate to is the managed workstation. So we focused on that, said, how can we provide better value? We provided the listing, and the conversation, engaged, and we got a good deal of traction, to the point where, one division decided that they wanted everybody to be equipped with laptops, which ended up being a really smart decision when we got into COVID, because they were all well equipped to work from home. Others that didn't had different challenges. But at the end of the day, they could see the cost of the duplicative devices. And we could also reconcile, Mary doesn't work for us, anymore. She left. Well, that's true, but Mary was in your division when we snapped the line once a year, right? So on 3/31, we would go to ServiceNow and draw a report. Whatever was there was deemed to be the report of truth. One example. The second is sort of related to that in terms of onboarding. So with 3,000 employees in many different divisions, as I said, 20 different areas that we produced invoices for, some of them demanded different levels, service levels, when it related to onboarding. One group wanted to be able to onboard somebody within 5 days. Others said 10 days are fine. With the idea that with 5 days, since you were getting expedited, or what I'll say is silver or gold level service, right? They would pay more. And after some careful analysis and scrutiny, what we determined is our model didn't reflect those additional enhanced levels of service. And in fact, everybody, regardless of how quickly we did it, was being charged the same amount. So we made a decision that we were going to list onboarding as a service, and everybody would pay a standard level of service. And if you wanted an expedited level of 5 days instead of our 10-day standard, you would pay additionally for that. And we went to our service delivery folks and said, give us an estimate about how much time you're spending differently for different devices and what you do. Because if you were getting a device prepared for someone who was a 10-day rollout and a 5-day person came in, boom, you stopped on this one and you moved, right? So it was an interruption. So we ended up developing what we thought was a sound cost model. And the first time we presented it, of course, we got eyebrows raised. And the one woman at the end of the table from the business said, what is this? You're doubly charging us. And we said, no, we're not doubly charging it. Everybody gets standard level of service, but you've elected to get a 5-day rollout. So you're going to pay, an extra charge or an increased charge. And it would immediately, well, that's not fair, right? Interestingly, someone else from a different business who was sitting in the meeting said, well, what do you mean that's not fair? She said, that's the difference of sending a package, overnight mail versus you get it in 5 or 10 days, right? The postal service, you pay more for an increased level of service, right? So the beauty of that for us was we weren't defending it. Somebody else from the business was, we were delighted to just sit back and let that conversation ensue. But at the end of the day, guess what? The lady decided that they didn't need 5-level rollout service anymore. 10-day was just fine because she didn't want to spend the, $50,000 or whatever additionally we were charging her over the course of a year to give her this 5-day rollout, right? So again, we focused on things that seemed to really hit at home in terms of a service that they could truly identify with, right? And the third example, again, sort of related to the workstation, but software licenses. Everybody always remembers to ask when they need something, a new piece of software. But if they don't need it anymore, how often do they come back and say, oh, I don't need it anymore, return it to the inventory, let someone else use it, right? So in a similar way of providing an inventory listing of devices, we began to look at the most costly pieces of software and also identify the individuals in the various divisions who had these, high cost licenses as an effort to once a year at least reevaluate, do you still need it? Why do you still need it, right? And in some cases, we ask for escalated approval levels. In other words, certain pieces of software would come in as a request through ServiceNow, and we put a hook or trap in the system where it would get elevated to the leader of the business division in these particular cases for their approval before that cost expenditure was approved. They didn't like the idea at the end of the year that suddenly they were hit with this bill, and they really had no idea around who had the licenses, right? And were they using them or not using them? And one of the folks earlier today, mentioned the fact that, we could go back, you can go back and, using system tools, see who last used a piece of software and when they used it, right? And what we were finding was many of these licenses were sitting dormant, yet I was getting requests from my asset management group to tell me that I needed to buy more licenses because we were going to be over our thresholds, right? So it was, again, a collaborative look at things, but I think these are just 3 small examples of things that had great meaning to the business that we sort of identified, and because of that identification could begin to then have frank discussions about the costs involved and whether those costs were justified or needed to be reevaluated. So,
David, this is Carmen. How are you?
Good, Carmen. What do you have?
I want to go back to the onboarding with
Yep.
the level of service.
Yep.
Since you bill on a yearly basis and that level of service was chosen at a higher level, what is your example? Silver and gold.
Yep.
So are they paying for the silver and gold for every person that they're onboarding?
If that person was, so one division in particular, Carmen said, when a new employee comes on, we want that device rolled out to them within 5 days. And if they receive that service, we kept track of that during the year. We would know how many staff were onboarded through our records. And we would say to them that we onboarded X number of people, and they would get charged for that. Yes.
So that makes that additional onboarding charge for that area the same. No matter whether they really wanted it 10 days or 5 days, it would be the 5-day extra charge.
Well, we, again, from a business relationship management, we said to the leadership, do you want 10-day service or do you want 5-day? And they had previously said, we want 5-day. We said for all employees, she said yes. So we only gave them what they asked for. In retrospect, they ended up
for all employees. Okay.
Correct. Yeah. They ended up regretting it, I think, in the end, or, but again, at the end of the day, it's about choices, right? They're deciding how they're.
And you made your point by making them think about it.
Exactly. Right. Where before it was never apparent on the invoice, but bringing it out made it apparent, right? Did I answer that for you?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
So, more than ever, right? No one said this so far today, and I think this is another nugget that we can all take away. More than ever, it's apparent that the backbone of business is on IT because of COVID, right? Everybody had to react, bang, like almost, in a heartbeat, right?
It proved the value of IT real fast.
Exactly, right? So use that realization to your advantage as you negotiate. And here's an example of how we use that at the Office of the State Comptroller. This happened in March as everybody was getting ready for our new state budget to be unveiled in April, right? And everybody knew that our budgets organizationally were going to take a hit. And our history at the State Comptroller's Office is if there's a budget crunch, they balance the budget by stopping hiring, right? And typically every department got equal cuts, right? Equal percentage cuts based upon, everybody has to cut 15% or whatever of their hiring, right? And I went to my boss and I said, no. And he looked at me and he said, what do you mean, no? I said, you need to go and lobby with leadership that don't cut my IT budget, right? The backbone of business is on IT. We're working day and night to image laptops to get a mobile workforce out there from their homes, right? You can't cut my staff, right? Not only you can't cut my staff, I need to be able to fill the positions, right? We, for the first time last year at Nan's urging, thank you, Nan, decided that we had reached a point in our maturity that we could actually produce an executive summary for the leadership of the State Comptroller and demonstrate the value of IT and show them with some integrity where those dollars were being spent and which systems really were costing us a lot of money. And we, Nan said, you've come a long way, David, you're ready for this. And I did some evaluation and I agreed. I came to that realization as well. And I went and convinced my CIO. I said, I think it's time. So we put together an executive summary, which was presented like last summer of 2019, to the upper echelon of leadership at the State Comptroller, and was, again, the value that report presented to the leadership was overwhelming. We didn't know you could do this, but you're really showing us where our IT spend is and maybe which projects are really costing us money, and we need to take a strategic look at that, right? So with that executive summary kind of percolating in the background, and the fact that we had been very reactive in responding to IT needs, my CIO went back and lobbied for not having the IT budget cut, and he won, right? And I'm sure amongst his peers, He was not a favorite because others did have to take cuts. But you know, at the end of the day, it's the backbone of the business. If you want the business to succeed, right, you've now laid the foundation for showing the value of the services. Again, what is the service that you're bringing to the business? So in terms of better on-time invoices where the data has integrity and the business looks at that now with some confidence, right? Now the customers are coming to us and saying, you know, we're thinking about X, Y, and Z. How much is that going to cost? Which is the perfect scenario. That's exactly why we're all doing what we're doing, right? Thinking about it ahead, right? We'll get costs of how much does it cost to mail a letter, you know, from the data center, right? And there's discussion around that. But the beauty of it is that the business is asking the question and engaging with us, right? Business decisions are thinking about those implications of costs, but they're doing it now in advance of the purchases, right? And when we have our yearly customer meetings to present the invoices, not only do we give you know, a particular area their invoice, but we make the invoices of all the other areas available to them as well. So they get a picture of not just their area's spending, but the organizational spending. And, you know, so I represent, you know, 40% of the organization's spending on X, Y, Z. And what's most intriguing to me is that we have had some scenarios where business leaders and business customers have come to our CIO and said, if we can collaborate and work together, I'm willing to yield some portion of my program budget back to IT. Make your budget bigger, right? Because I understand the value of IT and what you're bringing to the support of my business. So instead of me having a certain program over here, we can collaborate and put in a new IT system or improve the system that we have, right? I'm willing to give that money back to you folks for the value that you're providing to us. So it's been an extremely rewarding journey. You know, when Nan and I met several years ago over lunch at a conference, right? It was doldrums and dismal. I'll say it like that. And you know, what we did realize is that everybody's in a different part of that journey. It's great to hear everyone's stories because in some ways we can all relate to the trials and tribulations that we all have. We're all having similar problems and similar issues and experiencing similar scenarios, right? So it was great a couple years after our initial conversation to have a follow-up call and be happy about some progress that we made and continued advancement and continued maturity to the point where now, having retired this past June, I felt like I left our IT financial management systems in a good, stable position, in very good hands with educated IT folks as well as educated business folks, right? And hopefully the framework for that to continue after my departure. So with that, I'll open it up to anyone's feedback or insights or questions. I welcome them.
Thanks, David. And you guys really have done, you know, a good 3 or 4 years of hard work to get to the point where you can have those engaging conversations with the business. So it's great of you to be able to share the specific examples with people. I think those are all great places for people to look at as you know, points to start in their journey. It's an end point to aim towards, right?
Yeah, I think, you know, the first time that you're in a meeting with a customer and they ask a question a certain way or they make an observation, almost in the back of your head, you say, oh my gosh, it's making an impact, finally, right? You come to the realization that they're beginning to change their mindset You know, I think as Ginger talked about earlier, right? It's all about the mindset. And at the end of the day, from my point of view, it's about people, right? It's about the trust and the relationships that you have with the business. So when you present the invoice, you're not arguing about whether the numbers are correct or not. Again, like we've said, it's in the right direction. It's meant to be thought-provoking. It's meant to be evaluative. And it's a good hard look at things to make sure that IT dollar spend is in the right place.
Awesome. Do we have anybody else who's got a question or maybe a story of your own actionable lever that made a difference for the business?
This is Carmen. I agree with the COVID virus making an impact on the IT reputation. We were able to go remote working with only a few laptops needing to be ordered because that we prepared to remote work. We're in a hurricane area. So going back to that story before, we have to be in a disaster recovery plan. So that helped us a lot. So I don't know if that would be consideration for any others.
Yeah, I think, you know, again, as I say, I retired in June, but I know part of the discussions that I was starting to spearhead before my departure was how does something like COVID or the disaster planning, right, impact your future idea? Are we going to replace desktops? Or are we going to go fully to laptops, right? Will the laptop, are we just going to decide organizationally that we're going to bite the bullet and we're going to invest in that because it absolves us of so many other issues that we could have in terms of disaster and attending to the business, right? But we could have only reached that point, you know, because someone could say, well, how much more does a laptop cost than a desktop? And we have that information because of our maturity now.
Exactly. Same here. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Any other questions or comments, guys? Well, again, David, thanks so much for spending time and sharing your journey with us and the great examples of actionable levers that people can be inspired by. And we look forward to keeping in contact and watching you help some other people, perhaps.
Very good. My pleasure.
Wonderful conversation, David. Thank you.
Thanks, Carmen.